is Stephen Roach Knight, co-founder of Transform Network. I am also an admin here at the Christian Left and currently special assistant to Bishop William Barber, president of Repairs the Breach and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival. And I'm very excited to be here today with my dear friend, Gareth Higgins. And by way of introduction, Gareth, you are a film critic, a Sojourners magazine columnist, founder of the porchmagazine.com and the Movies and Meaning Festival, co-founder of the New Story Festival, founding director of the Wild Goose Festival, and of course, a peace activist and author of several books, including The Seventh Story, Us, Them, and the End of Violence, the children's book Corey and the Seventh Story, How Movies Help Save My Soul, and Cinematic States. That is your bio, or most of it anyway. You also lead Ireland retreats, which is fascinating. But for those who may not be familiar with who you are, please tell us, who is Gareth Higgins?
Oh, goodness. I'm just a guy from the north of Ireland, and even the word guy is a subjective term regarding whatever that means. I'm a person from the northeast corner of the island of Ireland. I'm 46. I'm currently 4 months since my last haircut because I'm near Belfast at the moment, and there's no hairdressers or barbers open.
You're looking good. Fabulous hair.
Thank you. And I think, I always appreciate it when somebody said to me once, don't ask somebody what they do, but at some point in the conversation, maybe ask them what their work is, right? My friend Mike Riddell, Kiwi writer, said that when people would ask him, what do you do? He would say, sometimes I take my dog for a walk on the beach, because that was what he did, it's what he did. So you asked me, who is Gareth? I'm a person trying to learn a better story, because I've come to believe that storytelling is how we make sense of our lives, and a lot of us are not making good sense of our lives, or healthy sense, or truthful sense, partly because we've never been initiated into the consciousness that we are telling stories all the time. So I feel called and privileged and blessed to be involved in work around storytelling and story learning. And so if you ask me what my work is, somebody once described me as a story activist, which I think is a wonderful job title. I don't know if I've earned it, but I am working into it, which is all about through creative convenings like festivals and retreats, through writing projects like the Porch Magazine and the books that I write, and through literal storytelling nights, trying to learn more about the stories we're telling and ask a very simple question, and that is the story true, and is the story helpful? And if it's not true, or it's not helpful, or if it's not as true or not as helpful, let's find a way that's truer and more helpful. And for me, that's all about, does it move us toward love, or away from love? And love is not a sentimental thing, although it does include sentiment, emotion, care, concern. But love is really about the call and response and the exchange of service between and among human beings and the rest of the ecosystem. M. Scott Peck has a definition of love, which goes something like, love is extending myself for the purpose of somebody else's spiritual growth. And you can see that if like I'm the only one doing that, it kind of becomes martyrdom, Sure. And if you're the only one doing it, it's very selfish on my part. But if we're both willing in our relationship as friends, or even in our relationships with strangers, to take a risk on extending ourselves for the sake of the growth of another. All kinds of things that look miraculous will happen. And here's the thing, they're not miracles.
Mm,
They're actually totally ordinary facts of life, or they should be, and they should be more common than perhaps they are.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so that's
Well,
a thought.
folks are already getting an introduction to why I love you. You were one of my dearest friends in the world, and I could just listen to you talk all day. But I am going to jump in and ask a few questions
Yeah.
because we are here to talk about your most recent labor of love, this book, How Not to Be Afraid. Um, and I, for everyone who's watching, I'm gonna save the most obvious question to the very end, which is how do you not be afraid? But we'll hold that one. You'll have to stay to the
Well,
very
the
end of the
answer to that
conversation.
question is read the whole book.
That's right, exactly. There's a book. There's a whole book here to answer that question. Um, but you talked about a little bit there in describing you're in Northern Ireland at the moment, and you grew up in Northern Ireland
Yeah,
during the Troubles, and you
yeah,
write about that a bit in the book.
sure.
And tell us about how that sort of shaped you and informed this, this idea of fear. And I mean, you had a father who you didn't know necessarily if he was coming home. There might be a car
Yeah,
bombing or something.
yeah. So I think, I mean, lots of families of my generation have similar stories of anxiety and concern and real threat. You know, lots, whatever your background was, in the late 60s, 70s, 80s through the early 90s, uh, there was a what's called a in sociological terms a low level intensity civil conflict, which can be a euphemism, because what it meant in practice was that nearly 4,000 people were killed and 43,000 directly physically injured, and countless more emotionally injured,
Mm, mm,
traumatized.
yeah.
And the violence was occurring because of a centuries old dispute over who gets to have a stake in this land,
Mm,
over who gets to be consider themselves to belong here, where the border lies on the island, if there should be a border, and how our various communities treat each other. Um, it's obviously more complicated than that, but the heart of it comes down to belonging, dignity, and then more modern concepts of human and civil rights. Um, so I grew up knowing that this was the reality around me. I was personally quite protected and sheltered from direct physical violence.
mm,
A lot of people lived in neighborhoods where, you know, they would have been closer to specific, you know, actual direct acts of violence. But I sometimes think that's a bit of a sort of falsely self-deprecating thing. You hear a lot of people around here saying things like that because we want to, I suppose we want to respect the dignity of people who suffered more than we did.
mhm,
But there's also, in my view, it's very difficult for people to come to terms with what really happened and how awful it was
mm,
and how serious it was. And one of the ways we do protect ourselves from trauma in the short term is to put distance between us and it, maybe not want to think about it or talk about it. So even when I talk about it today, I want to talk about it in ways that don't diminish the suffering, but also don't plunge us into just repeating the feeling of that suffering. And on the other hand, I want to make sure that I talk about the countless heroic acts carried out by individuals and communities right across this society through the late 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s
mm,
that prevented things from being worse and also helped build a raft that helped take most of the society towards a more cooperative context, which is what we have now with a peace process and people sharing power for the common good.
Yeah.
Last thing I'll say about it is, it's strange when you grow up with, say, frequent bomb scares in the city center, in the main shopping district. It wasn't so much that it scared me as it was an inconvenience. Certainly by the time I was aware, like in the 70s in particular, there were bombs that went off with no warning in the city center and multiple people were killed. By the time I was kind of going into the city center myself, 12, 13, 14 years old, sometimes a bomb scare would happen and you would see a road would be cordoned off and you knew, okay, I just can't go down there for a while.
Yeah.
And you don't really reflect on the madness of it until later, until you've lived in a society perhaps where that isn't considered normative. But honestly, it's a little bit like coming back here to live near Belfast for a period of time. That's we're here for a period of time. We live in the US, but to come back here and experience universal healthcare again for the last couple of months points out to me the utter absurdity, insanity of the fact that there isn't universal healthcare in the US. You normalize the circumstances that you're in.
Right.
And part of it's about protecting yourself. But I think part of it, it kind of, that needs to be unpicked a little bit so we can really face some of the more painful things.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's interesting. That's another kind of fear, the fear of having medical bills that you can't afford to pay. But I just reflecting, like you just did, a bit on your childhood. I mean, I believe you've been thinking about writing this book for a while, haven't you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that journey, this with this idea, and kind of how it finally has come to fruition.
Yeah. I would say that fear was the dominant emotion for most of my life.
Mm.
Um, and I didn't know to articulate it like that. I just knew that I felt scared, anxious, that I wasn't safe.
Mm.
And a few years ago, I took an online questionnaire that was helping people reflect on the possibility of whether or not they had the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And the questionnaire had 40 questions. And it said if you said yes to more than 2 questions, there's a good chance that you might be a candidate for the clinical diagnosis of PTSD if you answered yes to more than 2 of these 40 questions. And I answered yes to 38 of the 40 questions. And I was kind of disappointed that I didn't get 100% on it, that there were 2 questions that I could honestly say no to, but I couldn't honestly say no to the other 38. And that's not about my suffering being greater than yours or anybody else's. It's actually a window for anybody who's experienced something similar, that you're not alone.
Mm.
And also, these things aren't rocket science and they don't need to be over dramatized. So I went to see a therapist who was a specialist in questions of trauma. And after a few sessions, I said to him, do you think I have PTSD? And he said his particular perspective was, I don't like to use the D in PTSD because to my mind, or to his mind, there's nothing disordered about it. It's PTSD. What is clinically called PTSD is a perfectly natural reaction to abnormal, traumatizing circumstances. And yes, I can see the semantic argument that calling it a disorder can actually be a way of respecting the situation. But in my case, it was really liberating to hear this guy say, clinically, yeah, well, you are worthy of the word of the diagnosis, PTSD. You have the symptoms. But then he said, the way I would put it is, I think you have some post-traumatic stuff. And we're going to work with that stuff. Mm. And the way we're going to work with it is twofold. One is through helping you look at the story you're telling yourself about your life, your past, your present, your future. And we're also going to help you start to live in your body more.
Mm.
I think a lot of us, particularly in the industrialized West, have been alienated from our bodies, alienated from our spirits. And there's neuroscience to back this up, that the pace with which you move, whether you walk or if you're a wheelchair user, the pace with which you breathe, the pace with which you talk, if you're a talker, actually has I think they call it a recursive relationship, which is there's no chicken and egg. Like this thing leads to this thing, but this thing leads to that thing, and it doesn't matter which one went first. So sometimes my thoughts can be racing, and so then I speak fast. But the thing I hadn't understood before was sometimes I speak fast and it makes my thoughts race. Sometimes I move fast and I get more anxious. I don't have to be anxious before I do the fast moving. And so one of the things I've come to learn, and I still try to practice, is to slow down my breathing and slow down my talking and slow down my moving. And I've more recently been introduced to a Buddhist teaching about 70% effort is better than 100%, because nobody can give 100% effort to anything 100% of the time. But 70% is more sustainable, and you actually have a sense of achievement after you've given 70% effort to something, or you've mapped out your day and planned, put 70% of the calendar appointments in that you would normally put in, because you never fulfill everything that you put in your to-do list anyway.
Right.
Why add more guilt and fear on top of it? So you asked me, I've been thinking about this for years. I wanted to explore my own fear, and I wanted to draw a relationship exists between my inner life, my external presence in the world, and also how I impact other people, which is one of the paradoxes of fear. Because I think those of us who really experience a lot of fear, we are worried a lot of the time about what somebody else might do to us, or about what circumstances might do to us. And especially if we've been traumatized, that can be a repetition of something that did actually happen to us in the past. And we have the memory and the fear of that thing from the past. Now, there's two pieces. Actually, there's three really good pieces of news here. One is the hypothesis that I work with is that the worst thing that's going to happen to you has probably already happened, because you were less equipped to deal with anything that happened before this moment, right? You were less equipped in childhood. You were less equipped even yesterday, even because we're having a conversation right now that is hopefully bringing some light to fear. So the worst thing's probably already happened. And your feelings of fear about something like that happening again are to do with your tender, compassionate memory toward the younger version of you who was wounded in this way. There are things you can do by yourself and with others that will help heal that younger person who still lives inside you. There's a story I tell in the book about something that happened to me when I was 10 years old that I found to be one of the most traumatizing events of my life. And the details don't matter that much, because you've got your story, I've got mine. And sometimes we just need to nod at each other and say, yeah, I feel you, I see you. And you don't need to share the details. And sometimes when we share the details, we can re-traumatize ourselves. So there are ways of learning how to tell the story in a healing environment. But one of the things I try to explore in the book is how, from this perspective, 46, looking back at the 10-year-old in my heart, in my spirit, inside me, and asking, what would I do today if I saw my 10-year-old self being targeted this way by bullies? And I have access to resources that I didn't have then, that I can summon up. And I like to use the mythic archetypes of the idea that there's a sovereign inside me, a decider with authority, that there's a warrior, not a destroyer, but a protector who will stand between vulnerable people and whatever's targeting them. There's a lover, and that's the one that has compassion and feels. And there's a magician who can make lemonade out of lemons, or a whole orchard of lemon trees out of the seed of one lemon. And what I do is I meditate when I feel this memory of this fearful thing coming up. I meditate on this thing that happened when I was 10. And I retell the story with those 4 archetypes in the 46-year-old me, and say, if my sovereign had been there that day, he would have said, it's okay, Gareth, I've got this under control. This is what we're going to do. The lover inside me would put my arms around the 10-year-old me and say, I love you. You're beautiful. You're perfect. I'm going to stand here and be with you in this. You're not alone. The warrior inside me would turn around and face these other bullies and say, hey guys, if you want to get to him, you got to go through me first, and probably growl. And that would be enough to make them go away. It's not destructive, right? It's not destructive energy. And the magician would be able to whisper in the ear of 10-year-old Gareth, 36 years from now, you're going to publish a book in which you tell this story that at the moment you're terrified to tell anybody. And now you're going to tell strangers, because metabolism has happened. Now it's not complete. So that's I said there were 3 pieces of good news. One is, I think the worst thing that's happened to you has probably already happened, because you had less resources before we talked about it today. The second thing is your own birth was probably the most traumatic thing that happened to you. You know, I've met some people who tell me they remember being in the womb. I don't remember being in the womb. I don't have a conscious memory of that. But my sense is that in the womb, we were totally secure. We had no questions about the future or the past, because we had no concept of time. I mean, we were truly Zen-like in the moment. All our needs were cared for, and we were swimming in this amazing cave that had miracle water in it, because we were even breathing the water. And then one moment, and bear in mind, this would have been the first experience we had of knowing that such a thing as a moment existed, because up till that point, there were no moments. it just is.
Yeah.
One moment, all the water rushes out of the cave, and we get thrust down a tunnel that gets narrower as it gets longer. Or for some of us, the roof of the cave got torn open, and these Godzilla hands came in and pulled us out. And whether we went through the tunnel or got pulled out through the roof, all the security that we'd experienced up to that moment must have seemed under great threat. Must have. And then the next thing that happens is this Godzilla cuts the cord that connects us to this security. And no wonder we cried. No wonder we cried. I'm just going to turn the computer because the sun's in my face there. But and if you're listening to this conversation, no matter what the wounds of your childhood or your life there since have been, your birth might have felt like dying, but it wasn't. Your birth might have felt like the end, but it wasn't. And I think if we can transform our fear of death, the death that will happen to all of us in the future, by looking back to the last time it happened to us, and allow for the possibility that maybe there is more to this world than we know. And maybe those moments, fleeting as they may be, where we have experienced transcendence, ecstasy, love, connection, that maybe there's a flame out at the point of death and our brains are flooded with that. Or maybe there's what many wise people believe, a redemption of it all, a wiping of every tear, and something that goes on beyond there. What I'm more interested in is activating that now in this moment.
Yeah.
And there was a third piece of good news, but I can't remember what it is at this point. Hopefully those 2 pieces are good enough.
Those two are pretty good. That's great. You touched on this a little bit, and this was going to be my next question.
Yes.
Throughout the book, especially in the first part of the book, you connect fear to stories, and
Yeah.
storytelling, and how telling a better story can be the antidote to
Yeah.
many of our greatest fears. And obviously, you've co-founded the New Story Festival, so I know this is a big theme for you.
Hmm.
And I'm curious, like, how did you come to this realization? You mentioned that that you had this some of this insight from a therapist talking about um, getting at a better story, but just curious, like what that kind of what your process has been and
Yeah.
learning
Gosh. Um, I would really, I'd really love to be able to remember. Uh,
and
so there've been, first of all, my mother is a theater teacher, and she raised me on stories. You know, when
yeah,
we
yeah.
were kids on road trips, she would tell us the stories of Shakespeare plays, and then she got me into good movies. Um, I remember seeing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest when I was 13 on TV because my mom and my dad wanted me to see it because they thought it would be good for me to see it. And having this experience that I hadn't, maybe I'd had before, but I hadn't noticed. And now I know it was empathy for people who are not like me,
Mm,
because there were these characters in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest who felt like, gosh, I'm not like these people at all, but also I am deeply like these people, right?
right, right.
Um, and so, story as what Roger Ebert called a machine for empathy was very alive. And I grew up around some compelling, charismatic storytellers. Someone you and I both know, Tony Campolo, a Baptist minister and sociology professor, who's one of the most captivating public speakers, who would tell stories about suffering transformed through service.
Mm,
And I was just inspired by that. Um, and then in later life, I got mentored into becoming a sociologist for a while, and did some academic work in sociology, which is about telling the big story of society, understanding the dynamics underpinning a society and what social processes are uh, uh, as in relation to how individuals live. Like, and so this notion of we're enmeshed as individuals in communities and societies, and we're having to figure out how we relate to this group over here, and what does it mean to be a member of this group here. And then more laterally, there were uh, there were three teachers who came into my life that opened this up to me. One is Charles Eisenstein.
if you can only remember two, it's okay. You can forget the third one.
One is Charles Eisenstein, especially in his book, "The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible," which is
Mm,
really about, so much of the damage and oppression and pain and suffering in our world is based purely on the fact that a group of people are believing a story. You know, um,
mm,
oppressive student debt exists because there's a group of people who believe that the only thing you can do with oppressive student debt is have to pay it back,
right.
right? That's
Yeah.
the noble, honorable thing to do. And until a year ago, the idea of a universal basic income, for instance, was held with great skepticism by many people. But the pandemic has shown that it might be not only a decent option, but it might be inevitably necessary. And the society doesn't collapse when people's basic needs are taken care of. So, and there's much more poetry to the way Charles writes about the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. Then the other two thinkers who are poles apart in terms of their aesthetics and I think their beliefs on the surface, but at the same time, I think that they have a lot more in common than folks might think. One is the spiritual teacher Byron Katie,
Mm,
and the other is the academic psychologist Steven Pinker. And Byron Katie had a revelatory experience about 35 years ago in the midst of a profound depression, where she woke up to the notion that she was suffering because she was believing her thoughts, and that if she questioned her thoughts, she could release herself from suffering or be released from suffering.
hmm
And over time developed this very simple method of helping people discern what is the thought that I'm having for a start. What's the story I'm telling? Is it true? What's my life like when I believe this thought? Who would I be without this thought? And if I turn the thought around, are there alternatives to this thought that might be just as true or more true? And if those of you who are watching, if you haven't experienced Byron Katie lead a dialogue in this, go to thework.com and watch one of her videos working this through with somebody. It's just remarkably profound. And every time I do this practice, it releases me a little bit more from my own suffering and fear. Steven Pinker, on the other hand, who I think he's a convinced atheist. And so, for a start, he and Byron Katie are in very different places. But he wrote a book about a decade ago called The Better Angels of Our Nature, tracing how violence has declined throughout human history. And it's counterintuitive to what we've all heard. For instance, that the 20th century was the bloodiest in human history, to which he says, only if you believe that the 20th century ended in 1950. Because the first half of the 20th century was extremely bloody, especially with the Second World War. But the second half of the 20th century was relatively peaceful compared with previous centuries. And that the Second World War, in terms of its lethality per capita, the number of people killed per capita, is actually only the 9th most lethal event in human history, if I'm recalling the statistic correctly. And the others in the top 10 all predate the 20th century. I think the most lethal per capita event in human history was a series of wars in China, maybe 1,000 years ago, right? So he goes on to talk about how the evolution of etiquette helped reduce violence. So, for instance, people used to carry with them a knife when they were traveling, and the knife was to be used to eat with, but it was also used for self-protection. And of course, if you've got a knife on your body, compared with not having a weapon on your body, there's going to be more stabbings. But over time, once hotels and inns started providing their own silverware, people carried fewer knives. So that's the relationship between the development of etiquette and good table manners and the reduction in violence. One I really like is the emergence of the novel as a storytelling form. Up until Shakespeare's plays and then the novels of the Victorian era, the storytelling forms we had tended to be big epics about mythical characters. Even Tristan and Isolde, which I think is maybe like the 11th century, they're not the most psychologically complex or nuanced characters. You start to get more of that with Shakespeare. But then when Charles Dickens comes along and he writes a story like Oliver Twist about a little boy in a workhouse, and aristocratic women of the Victorian era who, because of patriarchy, their husbands are kind of requiring them to not do income generating work during the day. They have time on their hands, and they read the serialization of Oliver Twist in a newspaper. And they were aware of workhouses and they were aware of orphans being mistreated. But when you see it in the form of one person's story, what happens is this evolution of empathy. And so aristocratic women in England in the 19th century created the social movement that ended up getting rid of the workhouses, partly because they were reading a story like Oliver Twist. So what Pinker's work did was it switched on my sociological brain to look for where are these stories? What are these stories we're telling that aren't true? What's a truer version? And particularly, what's my place in those stories?
Yeah.
I'll give you one more example. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's, by one measure, 700 million people today are currently living in extreme poverty. And that's an astonishing number. It's an unthinkable number. It's an ungraspable number. It's more than twice the population of the United States, 700 million people. But as a percentage of the entire global population, it's 10%.
Mm-hmm.
200 years ago, 90% of the global population was living in extreme poverty, as measured by the same measure, which has now been updated for inflation. Okay, so 200 years ago it was 90%. Today it's 10%. Something has happened to radically reduce the percentage of the global population living in extreme poverty. There's two different ways you could respond to that story. Well, see, there's a third way. The first way is you could just ignore it, right?
Right.
And I suppose another way would be you could oppose, you could resist this and try and come up with alternative facts. But if the statistics I've just given you are true, if they're factual, there's two responses you could have. One would be to hear the 700 million number and think, where do we even start?
Mm-hmm.
I can't even begin to imagine how we could address that. Even if I rescue 699 million people from extreme poverty, there's still going to be 1 million people left in it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you flip it and you respond to, there's been a near 90% reduction in 200 years, the response could be, this is fantastic. It's already working itself out. There's nothing we need to do. And I would say both of those responses are defective. The ethical and whole response would be, goodness, there's 700 million people living in extreme poverty. And if I'm not one of those people, which I'm obviously not, because I'm on Facebook for a start, we're having a conversation using a webcam. There's lots of other, I mean, obviously I'm not living in any kind of poverty. The question I have to ask myself is, what's my place in this and what am I going to do with my power and resources about it? And the first thing I should do is ask, I wonder what it was that has happened over the last 2 centuries that has contributed to this reduction. Can we learn from this? Can we do some of the same things? And are there other things we can do better? To not do that is like, I think it was Pinker who used this example, is like if you didn't know how to do laundry and you went into a laundry room and you saw there was a lot of dirty laundry scattered across the floor, and then you went away and you came back a couple of hours later and the laundry had been done and dried and ironed and folded, you wouldn't say, wow, that laundry must have done itself. You would say, gosh, somebody must have done something to those dirty clothes. Yeah. I'd like to go find that person and maybe they can teach me how to do this and teach me the role that I can play here. So that story is a big story, but I think it's the same for all the stories in our lives. The first question to ask is, what story am I telling? The second question is it true, or is it the truest version of the story I can tell? And if you're not telling it in relation to the context of who you are in your social location and how you are in relation to other people, the story is at least incomplete. And then the next question is, what's a more helpful version of this?
Yeah. Well, that gets us to the second part of the book, where you tackle 7 of the biggest fears that everyone faces in their life. You talk about the fear of being alone, the fear of having done something that can't be fixed, fear of a meaningless life, fear of not having enough, fear that you'll be broken forever, fear of the world, and fear of death. And I think some of a good bit of what you were just talking about there with Pinker and kind of how do we look at the world, and is it getting better or are things getting worse? And that speaks a bit to the fear of the world, and maybe fear of death.
I think fear of the world in particular.
Yeah. So what would you say is your greatest fear right now?
Wow. Well, I could be facetious and say that those 7 fears are not the right ones to have written about.
Oh.
Wow.
I think those are good ones. I think they are.
I mean, the reason I chose, I think I think most fears can kind of fit into them, you know,
Yeah.
and welcome feedback from anybody who feels that there might be another headline fear that hasn't been mentioned there.
Dear Gareth, why didn't you mention my greatest fear in your book?
um,
I'm really putting you on the spot here.
no, I want to answer honestly, because I'm totally convinced that one of the next frontiers of the evolution of human society is authentic vulnerability in public and private
Mm.
by everybody, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, Brene Brown is the most prominent advocate of this, but I think it's for everyone. I think that, and there's a difference between authentic vulnerability and oversharing, and a difference between authentic vulnerability and um, portraying myself as somehow worse or weaker than everybody else. I'm just weak in some places that you're not, and you're weak in some places that I'm not, or vulnerable in some places that I'm not, or maybe we're vulnerable in the same place, and we can have a bit of solidarity and mutual empathy. And then it's good to bring a third party in who maybe doesn't feel the same burden that we do, but can help us carry it. And so, to respond to the "what's my greatest fear at the moment" question requires a degree of vulnerability, and I want to be authentic about it. So I'm thinking here, and I think it would be I often feel fear that I am not enough to be able to contend with whatever the day or the world is going to throw at me.
Mm-hmm.
And that aggressive masculinity is stronger than I am. Now, that's not what I believe in my highest self.
Mm-hmm.
In my highest self and in my most grounded moments, I believe that there's a strength as tenderness, and a warrior as protector rather than destroyer thing that's actually a more evolved version of masculinity. And by the way, when I say masculinity, I don't mean men. I mean something that's been called that may or may not line up with gender as you experience it. So, you know, for the sake of argument, like there's no matter what your gender is, you have an opportunity to manifest sacred masculinity and to challenge toxic masculinity. Clearly, people who experience themselves as men in the dominant culture are the ones that have the most work to do around toxic masculinity. But we also have a gift around how could we evolve beyond this destroyer thing into protector with an open heart, you know? And I'd want to say there's a lot of warrior type guys out there who want to be protectors, who really are concerned for their loved ones and who really feel like their way of life is under threat and so on. I want to help them, first of all, by respecting their human dignity, and then get into conversation about like what really matters to you and how can I help you protect the thing that really is important? And the thing that's really important is anything that advances love. It's not nationhood, and it's not private property. You know, that's not to say we're invited to open our doors and just accept rampaging hordes of other destroyers. You know, that's, and people will always say, are you saying I should just let my house be burned down by a bad guy? No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is there are things that are more important than private property and defending it. And there's things that are more important than defending nationhood or political ideology, whether it's from the left or the right. The most important thing is to displace ourselves from thinking that we are the protagonist of the story in exchange for the astonishing revelation and deeply liberating notion that love is the protagonist of the story. And it's the kind of love that I was talking about earlier, love as service to the common good. Love, as Mike Riddell says, the kind of love that enables or asks somebody, this is a very powerful metaphor he would use, that asks somebody to go to their next door neighbor who is unable to move and bathe their hemorrhoids. Right? Okay. That's love. That's love. And it's also wonder and joy and excitement and kindness and contentment. And sometimes it actually is the kind of love that enables you to lay down your life if it's the only option available to protect more vulnerable people. It is rarely the only option available. So my fear, the thing I fear the most, is the aggressive individualism of others coming against me. And that's a story I'm telling myself that has some data attached to it, but it's mostly made up. And I guess alongside that fear is that the fear is even more that I would just keep being afraid of that and never get over it. Are you most afraid of?
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say you reframed it a little bit at the end. What it sounds a little bit more like fear of the world. At that point, what I heard you saying earlier though was, I was gonna say it feels like it fits more in that fear of not having enough category and not being enough.
Yeah.
And I definitely a lot of my fear in general, and especially these days, is about not having enough, that scarcity versus abundance kind of thing. So the book is here. It's come to fruition. It exists. It's available. People can order it. What is your hope? What is your hope for the book and the impact you hope that it has?
I want it to help people and to gently push back about something you said at the start of our conversation. The point of the book is not to help people to not be afraid anymore or to not experience fear. The point of the book is to help us experience fear in a healthy way, which means, first of all, don't fear the wrong things, and to fear the right things in proportion to their reality, and to most of all fear the unlived life. And I don't mean to live in fear of it, but to have, you know, the way the idea that in Old English fear can mean respect, you know, to respect the possibility that I could live an unlived life through my own choices, and to respect even more so the awesome invitation to live a lived life, to live in devotion to reality with a capital R, to loving myself and to loving my neighbors, and to love the ecosystem as part of the ecosystem. I mean, what more would you want to do with your life? What more would you want to do? What's better than that? Again, it's not about being morally better than other people. It's just about what's more fun, what's more enjoyable, what's more fulfilling. So I want the book to help people, and I want it to help the widest range of people possible as individuals. And then the other thing I want is we encourage people to form these little circles, and you know, you and I are in one.
That's right.
Meets every Friday morning, and the invitation is to gather between 3 to 12 people, once a week, once a fortnight, once a month, whatever frequency works and is most life-giving, and to, you know, have a meal together if you can, even, you know, have a Zoom dinner until you can meet in person, and ask 4 questions. And these are 4 questions that have an ancient history, but we've kind of updated them. And I find these questions are extremely helpful in transforming fear, in building community, and in having a more fulfilled, meaningful life.
Mm-hmm.
The first question is, what's good? Or to use the older language that this comes from, what are the sources of consolation in your life since we last met?
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is, what's not so good? Or what are the sources of desolation in your life since we last met? And we ask that question not to try to activate the feeling of desolation, but to take one step back from the things that are burdening us, pulling us down. And then the third question, what am I feeling called to in my life that serves the common good? This is not self-help, self-actualization, self-centered. One of the challenges that I would offer to lots of what's become known as the modern mindfulness movement is, if it's just about me and my feelings and me clearing my emotions, that can be useful, but there's a huge risk that actually, if you only keep it about you, it will eventually go sour. It won't work, or you will become a fake. I can't remember what the right word is. Like a fake enlightened being that is actually removed from love. But if you feed the mindfulness into service, that's another thing that'll have a recursive relationship. The service will feed the mindfulness, which will feed the service. So we ask, what do I feel called to serve the common good? And sometimes the answer to that can be, I need to take a rest so that I can be more useful in the future, or because I am valuable. And then the fourth question, as you know, is having heard what we've heard today, does anybody want to ask for help? Or does anybody want to offer help? And the help can be as mundane as, I need a babysitter, or can I borrow that book, or I have a movie to recommend to you. It can be as profound as, I'm having an existential crisis and I need someone to go for a walk with me every Saturday morning for the rest of my life to talk to me about my problems, to which the response might best be, I'd be glad to walk with you 2 Saturdays in a row and then see where we're at, because maybe it'll only take 2.
Yeah.
Or as deep and as painful as happened in one of the circles that I've been a part of. My husband had a sudden bereavement of someone that he was extremely close to. And all of us experienced that at least once in a lifetime, I think. And our circle was able to be a place to help him talk about his grief and his love for Dawn, who died. And I think all of us need this in our lives. We need a place, and partly because our culture has this negativity bias, that when we ask, how are you doing? The answer is either superficial or negative. It's either, I'm great, or let me tell you about how awful things are. And we already have this negativity bias in our brains, and in our culture, and in our news media, despite the work of some honorable, noble journalists. So we're kind of starting at a disadvantage. And the invitation here would be to form little circles that help tune us into something that's more truthful about the world, and to practice affirmation and to allow room for the pain, but to not keep it self-centered. So that's the other thing I'd really like to have happen, would be that people would start circles.
Those are, can they find out more information about those on theporchmagazine.com?
Yeah. If you go to theporchmagazine.com and look at the drop-down menu item called Community Circles, and it's also in the book too.
Yeah. We're coming close to the end of our time, and I wanted to, because I'm just curious, and I know that this is the new thing, but you've still got a lot of other work going on. I should say I'm excited. You're going to be doing a similar conversation to this one with David Wilcox on Saturday, with music, and I love David Wilcox, so that'll be awesome. What else are you working on, or what else should people know about?
Oh, good question. Well, we take people to Ireland for retreats that also help people learn about peace building and bridge building as a way of thinking about peace as an inner journey and how we can enact it upon the world. And Kathleen Norris, the wonderful writer, and I have just started a project where twice a month we'll be public. Yeah, she also wrote the foreword to this book. She's a very generous heart. It's a project where twice a month we'll be publishing in an email newsletter essays about movies, books, music, TV, things in a culture that we're watching or listening to or reading that we find life-giving and can help promote the common good. And that's the website for that is soultelegram.com, S-O-U-L, soultelegram.com. But mostly at the moment, I want to tell more stories about how not to be afraid and encourage other people to tell their stories too. There's something here. One of the things I've really benefited from in writing this book is it's helped me take other writers who I admire less seriously in a good way, right? Because I would read like these great spiritual masters and think, oh, it's all well and good for you. There's no way I can ever do that. And now I read others and I think, oh, you're an ordinary person who wrote a really good book. and I think you're telling the truth and you're telling me about your journey here. And so the thing I don't want to have happen with this book is to achieve any kind of guru or specialist or master status. I mean, none of that's not even in the cards at all. I'm a fellow traveler who has had particular pain and particular medicine, and I'm trying to write about both. And your story is just as important. Mine is no more and no less important than yours. And I could learn things from you, Steve, and from everybody listening. And this is my contribution to help move the conversation forward a little bit from my particular perspective as an Irish person, as a cisgender white male, as a member of the LGBTQ community, and as someone who a little notification just went off on my computer, which says pain and trauma are part of the raw material from which our lives are formed. And so that was serendipitous. So if you're a person who's really experiencing acute pain and trauma right now, first of all, I encourage you to find a friend to talk with about this so that you're not going through it alone. But secondly, over the long term, there is a path you can follow that will transform or convert this pain and trauma into more life, And I don't want to be superficial about that. I don't know what particular thing anybody's going through at the moment, but I have found this to be true over and over again with people who've suffered the greatest traumas, that there's a path you can go on. It doesn't make it, I'm not saying it makes it all worthwhile, but there's another side to the tunnel of fear. And I'm up for crawling through that tunnel together.
Mm-hmm. Well, Gareth, you've been a dear friend, and you have been there for me through a lot of my pain and trauma and fear. And I know that you've poured a lot of yourself into this book, and I think this book can be a friend to a lot of people on that journey. And I hope folks will pick it up and read it and live with it. You're a beautiful friend. You're a beautiful writer, and I'm grateful to know you, and I'm grateful that we had this time to talk. So
thank you, Steve. I feel you are a beautiful human. I love our friendship. I'm so grateful to you for hosting me on this today. Thank you for doing that. And folks, those of you watching, Steve went out and bought new headphones so that he could do this. And that's another reason why many tens of thousands of you should buy my book.
That's
because
right.
then I will be able to reimburse him for the headphones.
There we go.
I'm not saying that I will do that.
He could if you buy the book. He could. That's the point. Love you, man. I love you. All right.